The snow was not falling. It was driven. It came sideways, hard as sand, stinging the raw parts of her face that were not already numb. Clara did not know if her feet were still in the rags of her boots. She could not feel them. She only felt the ice in her lungs, a sharp ache with every breath, and the deep, throbbing humiliation that burned hotter than the frost. Her legs were a tangle of pain, bloodied from thorns and sharp rocks she had stumbled over in her flight. The thin cotton of her dress was torn to ribbons, offering no defense against the wind, which seemed to hunt her specifically. It clawed at her back, finding the long, weeping welts there, and made her cry out, a thin sound that the storm swallowed whole. She was fleeing two forks. She was fleeing the faces of the women, pinched with a righteousness that looked like hate. She was fleeing the hands of the men, rough and quick, acting as self-appointed protectors of the town's virtue. Clara, a widow at 24, had been deemed a threat. Her crime, they whispered, was seduction. Her real crime was existing, beautiful and alone, in a place that feared both. Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, had been the one to point the finger. "She lures our men with those eyes," she had declared in the street. "She is a stain on this decent town." They had not given her a chance to speak. They found her by the creek where she washed her linens. The women held her. They called her foul names, names that stuck to her skin like tar. They used willow switches, sharp and stinging, until her back and legs were ribbons of fire. They tore her dress, cut her hair with sheep shears, and left her in the scrub oak as the sky turned the color of lead. "Get out," they had spat, "and do not come back." So she had run. She ran until the town was gone, until the low hills turned into steep, rocky inclines. She ran until her legs gave out, and then she crawled. Now, as the world began to blur, as the gray light of dusk failed, she saw a dark line in the snow, a fence. It was a boundary. Beyond it, perhaps a homestead, or perhaps just more wilderness, more wind. She did not know if she had the strength to cross it. She reached for the top rail, her hand a frozen claw. The rough wood bit into her palm, but the pain was distant. She hauled herself over, tumbling in a heap on the other side. The world was narrowing to a pinprick of light. She saw the dark shape of a lean-to, the silhouettes of horses stamping against the cold. She smelled hay and manure, the earthy scent of life. She tried to call out, but only a dry gasp escaped. She pushed herself forward, crawling on hands and knees toward the smell of the animals, toward the faint promise of shelter. Then the blackness at the edge of her vision rushed in and took her completely. She collapsed, a small, frozen mound on the edge of a remote ranch, just as the first true snowfall of winter began to descend, blanketing the world in white. Caleb heard the wind change pitch. It was no longer a moan. It was a shriek. That meant the real snow was coming, the kind that buried fences and trapped a man for months. He finished forking the last of the hay to his 3 geldings, rubbing the neck of the buck's skin. The horses were restless, their hides twitching. He trusted horses. People, not so much. He pulled his hat low and turned from the lean-to toward the cabin, his head down against the driving snow. He almost stepped on her. He stopped, staring. At first, he thought it was a deer, wounded by a wolf. Then he saw the shape of a hand, the tangle of dark, frozen hair. It was a woman, half buried in the new drift. Caleb's first instinct was sharp and hard. No, this was not his concern. This was the world's trouble, and he had come to this high, cold place specifically to be free of the world. He had built this ranch in the high meadow, miles from any trail, for a reason. He looked at the sky. The snow was coming down thick. She would be a frozen shape by morning, indistinguishable from the landscape. He could leave her. It would be simple. It would be the wind's doing, not his. He started to walk away. 1 step, 2. He stopped. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He saw another face in the snow. From a long time ago. Sarah, her eyes wide, not with cold, but with terror. Her hand reaching for him as the outlaws dragged her from the wreckage of the stagecoach. He had been too late then. He had been full of rage and whiskey, and he had not been fast enough. This woman, here, was still breathing. He could see the faint, shuddering rise and fall of her back. He swore, a low, harsh sound that the wind ripped from his mouth. He turned back. He did not like this. He did not like this at all. It felt like a trap laid by God himself. He bent, his knees cracking in the cold. He slipped one arm under her back, the other under her knees. She weighed nothing, just a bundle of frozen cloth and bones. He lifted her. Her head lolled back, and the snow fell from her face. She was young. Her lips were blue. He carried her toward the cabin, kicking the door open with his boot. The cabin was dim, smelling of wood smoke, old coffee, and the faint, metallic scent of gun oil. It was a single room, sparse and clean, a cot on one side, a table on the other. He did not put her on his cot. He laid her on the thick bearskin rug near the hearth, the one place in the room that held any real warmth. He shut the door, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the orange glow from the hearth's embers. He stirred the fire, adding 2 logs, then lit the lantern on the table. The yellow light spread, falling on the woman. She was a ruin. Her dress was shredded, frozen stiff. Her face was waxy, streaked with dirt and frozen tears. He got his hunting knife from his belt. He did not think about her being a woman. He thought about the task, the same way he would field dress a deer, methodical. He cut the frozen laces of her boots and pulled them off. Her feet were white and hard. Frostbite. He cut the dress up the side, the cold blade sliding against her skin. She did not stir. He pulled the frozen fabric away. He stopped. His breath hitched. Her back, from her shoulders to her thighs, was a geography of pain. Dark, swollen bruises overlapped with long, weeping cuts, crisscrossed and angry. Switches. He had seen it before. Town justice. The kind of justice that righteous people used when the law was not cruel enough for them. He went to the basin, broke the thin layer of ice in the water bucket, and poured. He set a kettle on the hook over the fire. He found the whiskey bottle. He did not have much, but it was better than nothing. He cut away the rest of the cloth. He took a rag, soaked it in the lukewarm water, and began to clean the dirt and blood from the wounds. He was gentle, but it was a clumsy, functional gentleness. When the water was hot, he added more, cleaning the cuts properly. He poured a little of the whiskey directly onto the worst of them. This time, she arched her back with a silent scream, a terrible, convulsive movement, but she did not wake. Caleb's face remained expressionless. He went to his supply chest and pulled out a small tin of goose grease. He rubbed it carefully onto her frostbitten feet, her hands, and the raw patches on her face. He found clean flour sacks and tore them into strips, binding the worst of the cuts on her legs and back. Finally, he covered her. He unfolded 2 thick wool blankets and laid them over her, then dragged the heavy winter buffalo hide from his own cot and added it to the pile. She was completely buried under the furs. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked down at the mound of blankets. He felt nothing. He told himself he felt nothing. It was just a body to fix, like a split fence rail. He sat down in his chair across the room and stared at the fire, listening to the snow rattling against the single window. He had not brought a person into this cabin in 6 years. He had not wanted to. The war had scraped him raw. He had been a good soldier for the Union, which meant he had been good at killing. It had hollowed him out. He came west to Wyoming, thinking the emptiness of the land would match the emptiness inside him, and he could build something clean. He had the ranch, a small herd of cattle, and Sarah. She was coming from Cheyenne on the stage to marry him. The stage never arrived. Just a rumor. Days later, a holdup by the Skinner gang. He had ridden out. He found what was left, the passengers, the driver, and Sarah. They had not just robbed them. They had taken their time. He remembered finding her ring, a simple silver band, in the dirt. He had spent the next year hunting them. He found all four, from the Platte River down to the Colorado border. He had not brought any of them back for trial. The sheriff in Cheyenne had looked at the four bodies Caleb left tied over their saddles and told him to get back to his mountain and stay there. The folks in Two Forks, the town down in the valley, whispered about him. They said he was dangerous. They said he was half mad with grief. He did not mind. It kept them away. Now this, a half-dead woman on his floor. Another piece of the world's filth washed up on his shore. He picked up the whiskey bottle, looked at the little that was left, and put it back down. He would need it for later. Clara woke to pain, a dull, heavy throb that seemed to come from her bones, her skin, her very soul. She was warm. The warmth was wrong. It terrified her. Her eyes flew open. A low ceiling of rough-hewn logs. Firelight. She was on the floor. She was covered in heavy furs. Across the room, a man sat in a chair, staring at the flames. She screamed, but the sound was a dry, small croak. She tried to sit up, to scramble away, but a bolt of fire shot up her back, and she collapsed, gasping. The man turned his head. His face was all angles and shadow, dark with a week's worth of beard. His eyes were not cruel. They were not kind. They were just empty. They looked right through her, as if she were a pane of glass. She recoiled, clutching the heavy buffalo hide to her chin. Her mind raced. Where am I? Who is he? She saw the hunting knife on his belt. She saw the long rifle leaning against the wall near his chair. This was a trap. Another man, another kind of pain. Do not, she whispered, her voice cracking. Please, do not touch me. She shut her eyes, waiting for the blow. The rough hands. Caleb looked at her. He saw the terror. It was not the fear of a stranger. It was the specific fear of a man. He recognized it. He had seen it in Sarah's eyes in his nightmares for 10 years. He nodded once, a short, sharp dip of his chin. You are safe from the cold, he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. He turned back to the fire. Clara kept her eyes on him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was too weak to run. Her legs would not hold her. She could not even sit up. She watched him, waiting for him to move, to speak, to make a demand. He did neither. Hours passed. The light in the single, small window faded from gray to black. The wind outside did not just howl. It screamed. It sounded like a woman grieving, loud and endless. Clara lay still, rigid with fear and pain, listening to the storm and the sound of the man breathing. He did not move from his chair. Night came on. The cabin grew colder. Save for the small circle of warmth around the hearth, the man stood, and Clara flinched. He did not look at her. He lit the lantern on the table, the light pushing back the shadows. He pulled out a wooden box full of tools and rags, and then he picked up the rifle. He sat down again and, in the pool of lantern light, began to disassemble the weapon. Clara watched him. She had nothing else to do. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles, but they moved with a strange, methodical grace. He laid each piece on an oily rag in perfect order, the click of metal, the scrape of the cleaning rod, the wipe of the rag. He worked like a machine, his focus entirely on the task. Once, he looked up, not at her, but toward the dark window, as if listening to something only he could hear. The firelight caught his eyes. They were haunted, like a house with the windows broken out and the wind blowing through. She had seen eyes like that on soldiers passing through her town after the war. Men who had seen too much and felt too little. She felt a strange, tiny flicker, not of safety, but of understanding. This man was not like the men in town. He was not full of righteous fire. He was empty. He finished the rifle, reassembled it with the same mechanical precision, and set it aside. He stood and went to the large black pot hanging over the fire. He lifted the lid. The smell of stew, thick, dark, smelling of rabbit and root vegetables, filled the cabin. He ladled some into a tin bowl. He walked over to her. Clara pressed herself back against the floor, her knuckles white as she clutched the fur. He stopped, just out of her reach. He bent down slowly and set the bowl on the floor beside her, along with a tin spoon. He said nothing. He did not look at her face. He just walked back to his chair. She stared at the stew, her stomach cramped, a painful knot of hunger. She waited. She watched him. He took his own meal, eating straight from the pot with a spoon. He was not looking at her. Slowly, wincing at the pull on her back and the fire in her legs, she reached for the bowl. The tin was hot. She dragged it under the furs. The stew was thick and barely warm, but it was the first food she had tasted in 2 days. It burned her throat, but it was a good burn. It was the burn of life. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons on tin and the howling of the wind, which now seemed to be trying to tear the cabin from the mountain. Clara drifted into a fitful, painful sleep. When she woke hours later, the fire was low, just glowing embers. The man was asleep in his chair, his head slumped to his chest, a blanket pulled over him. His boots were still on. The wind had stopped. The silence was absolute, heavier than the blankets. She looked at the window. The gray light of morning was pressing against it, but it was not light. It was a solid, pale mass. The snow had risen past the sill. It had risen past the middle of the window. It was no longer just a storm. They were buried. The world was gone. The silence in the cabin was as thick and heavy as the snow packed against the window. It was a suffocating, soundless weight. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting of the pale, bluish light at the top of the window frame and the twice-daily ritual of food. Clara regained her strength in small, painful increments. The frostbite on her feet and hands turned from waxy white to an angry, blotchy red that itched and burned. The cuts on her back began to scab, pulling at her skin with every small movement. After 3 days, she was able to sit up, wrapping the heavy blankets around her shoulders. She stayed in her corner, her back against the rough-hewn logs, her knees drawn to her chest. It was a defensive posture, the posture of an animal that expected a kick. She did not sleep, not really. She drifted into a gray fog of exhaustion, only to be thrown out of it by her own muffled cry. The nightmares were vivid. She saw the faces of the women from 2 Forks, their mouths twisted in righteousness. She felt the sting of the willow branches, smelled the sharp, metallic scent of her own blood on the snow. She would wake with a gasp, her heart pounding, to the dim, fire-lit reality of the cabin. And he would be there. Caleb never seemed to sleep. He was always sitting in his chair, or mending a piece of harness, or just staring into the fire. His presence was constant, a silent, brooding fixture in the room. He said nothing. He did not acknowledge her waking, her nightmares, or her fear. His care was methodical, devoid of any tenderness. It was the same way he cared for his horses or his rifles. He would rise before the faint light touched the snow, his movements quiet. He would break the ice in the water bucket, melt more snow, and put the coffee pot on to boil. He would go out. She would hear the scrape of the door, the rush of cold air, and then the rhythmic, muffled thud of his axe biting into wood. He would return, snow clinging to his beard and shoulders. He would cook oatmeal or fry salt pork. He would fill a tin bowl for her and set it on the floor, a few feet from her corner, along with a cup of water. He never got closer. He never looked directly at her. He ate his own share, cleaned the pans, and went about the business of survival. For 5 days, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the scrape of his knife as he whittled, and the relentless, whispering pressure of the wind. On the 6th day, the silence finally broke Clara. It felt worse than the shouting had. It was an emptiness that matched the one inside her. She had to know. Her voice was a dry rasp, torn from disuse. "Where am I?" Caleb was oiling a trap chain. He did not look up. His hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their work, rubbing the dark grease into the metal. "Nowhere worth remembering," he said. The words were flat, final. They were not meant to be cruel. They were just the truth as he saw it. This place was an ending, not a beginning. It was a place to be forgotten. The finality of it shut her down. She did not ask another question. She did not need to. She did not tell him her story. She did not speak of Two Forks or the women or the switches. She did not have to. Her body was a map of her crime. The way she flinched if he moved too quickly. The raw welts on her back that she could feel weeping through the flour sack bandages. The hollowed-out terror in her eyes. They spoke for her. He had seen this kind of damage before. The kind inflicted by a mob. He did not need the details. He did not want them. Trapped in the silence, with nothing but the four walls and the endless white outside. Clara's mind had nowhere to go but back. The memories she had been running from now cornered her. She had been Clara Jensen then. At 16, she was married off to Reverend Davies. He was a man twice her age, thin and pale, with hands that were always cold and wet. In the pulpit, his voice was thunder, full of fire and brimstone, terrifying the small congregation in the valley town. At home, his voice was a whisper, and that was far more terrifying. He was a man of corrections. He corrected her speech, her posture, the way she salted the stew. He used scripture as a weapon, a tool to pare her down, to make her small. "A silent woman is a jewel before the Lord," he would murmur when she tried to speak. "Let your countenance be modest. Clara, your beauty is a snare for the weak." He had been abusive, but his abuse was cold and methodical. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling of her soul. When she wept, he would call her hysterical. When she was silent, he called her sullen. He would lock her in the pantry for hours to contemplate her sins when she burned the bread. And there were the nights when he demanded his husband's rights, his cold body moving against hers in the dark, an act he performed with the same joyless piety as taking communion. Then, 2 years ago, a fever had swept through the valley and taken him. Clara was 22, a widow. At first, there was just relief, a deep, shuddering relief that made her sick with guilt. She was free, but she learned quickly that free was the most dangerous thing a woman like her could be in a town like Two Forks. She had no family to go to, no money. She took in laundry, she mended clothes. She tried to make herself invisible. She wore her hair in a severe bun, wore the drab gray dresses her husband had insisted on, and never met anyone's eyes. It did not work. Her beauty, which the Reverend had called a snare, was exactly that. The men in town, the ones who had feared the Reverend, now looked at her with a new, hungry boldness. The butcher gave her extra cuts of meat, his hand lingering on hers. Mr. Gable, the blacksmith, would find reasons to walk past her small house, and the women noticed, their wives, Mrs. Davies, the new preacher's wife, who had moved into the parsonage, Mrs. Gable, a gaunt woman with 3 screaming children, Mrs. Hemlock, who ran the mercantile. They saw the looks their husbands gave Clara. They saw the sin not in their husbands' eyes, but in Clara's existence. The whispers began. A widow, so young, living alone, it was not proper. They said she smiled at Mr. Gable. They said she had unpinned her hair when the butcher's boy delivered. Small, venomous lies that grew with each telling. Clara was a seductress, a harlot, a witch. She was a threat to their homes, their husbands, their brittle, hard-won standing. The violence, when it came, had been organized. Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Hemlock had led the group of 5 women. They found her by the creek. They called it a cleansing. They called it God's justice. They had been the ones to hold her down. Their hands were harder than any man's. They were the ones who had screamed the foulest names as the switches fell. Clara, huddled in the corner of Caleb's cabin, pulled the blanket tighter. The emotional weight of it all pressed down on her. She had survived. But for what? To be trapped in a tiny, silent room with a haunted man, buried in snow, with nothing to look forward to but more silence, more fear. The thought bloomed in her mind, dark and cold. Maybe it would have been better if he had left me in the snow. Survival was just a different kind of pain. She put her head on her knees and cried, but the sobs were as silent as the man across the room. She had no tears left. It was just a dry, rhythmic shaking. The weather changed on the 8th night. The wind died, and a strange, heavy pressure filled the air. The temperature rose just enough for the snow to turn to a heavy, wet sleet that rattled against the roof. Then, a low rumble shook the cabin. Clara's head snapped up. It was not the wind, it was thunder. A high-mountain thunderstorm in the dead of winter. It was wrong. The sound was deep, resonant, vibrating in her chest. Another rumble, closer this time, followed by a sharp crack that sounded like the cabin itself was splitting in two. Clara cried out, a real sound this time. The noise. It was too much like the sound of the branches, the sound of the men's voices shouting, the sound of her own screaming. Lightning flashed, a brilliant, cold white that illuminated the snow-packed window. The world outside was visible for a second, a blinding, chaotic white, then plunged back into darkness. The panic was immediate and overwhelming. It clawed up her throat. She could not breathe. The cabin was too small. The sound was everywhere. She scrambled from her corner, the blankets falling away. She was on her hands and knees, crawling toward the only light, the low, steady glow of the hearth. Caleb was there, sitting in his chair, watching the fire. Another crack of thunder, so loud it shook dust from the rafters. Clara whimpered and pressed herself against the warm stones of the hearth. As far from the window as she could get, she was trembling so violently her teeth chattered. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. She was not even sure what she was asking for. The sound of the thunder blended with the memory of the women's voices. Harlot, filth, stain. Caleb turned his head. He looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, he saw she was not just cold. She was not just hurt. She was broken. She was terrified, not of him but of the sky, of the sound, of the memories the sound was dragging to the surface. He did not move. He just sat there, his stillness a rock in the middle of her storm. Clara choked on a sob. She could not bear the sound. She could not bear the memories. And she could not bear the silence from him. "Do not leave me alone," she pleaded, the words tumbling out. "Please, just do not go." He had been planning to get up, check the horses in the lean-to, make sure the storm had not spooked them. But he stopped. He looked at this woman, curled up on his hearth like a dying animal. He saw the raw terror in her eyes. It was an echo of the terror he had lived with for 10 years. He stayed in his chair. He did not speak. He just sat. Clara watched him. The thunder rolled again. Farther away this time, she took a ragged breath. He was still there. He had not moved. He had not told her to be quiet. He had not touched her. He had just stayed. Her breathing began to slow. The frantic pounding in her chest eased. Just a little. His presence, silent and solid, was an anchor. It was the only thing in the world that was not shaking. A long minute passed. The storm rumbled, moving east. The worst of it was over. "Please," she whispered, her voice steadier. "Sit closer." It was the bravest thing she had ever said. She was inviting the shadow into her light. Caleb's jaw tensed. This was a line. She was asking him to cross it. He did not want to. He was no comfort. He was a man made of old grief and sharp edges. But he looked at her, huddled and small, and he saw the profound, desperate need. He could not deny it. Slowly, his joints cracking. He stood up from his chair. Clara flinched, pulling back. He stopped. He waited until her breathing evened out again. Then, instead of coming toward her, he moved to the side. He sat down on the floor, his back against the log wall near the hearth. His legs stretched out. He was no longer above her. He was on her level. There were 5 feet of empty floor between them, but it felt like a universe had shrunk. The tension in the cabin was no longer cold and empty. It was alive. It was thick with unspoken things. The firelight flickered, casting shifting shadows on their faces. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the dying rumble of the thunder and the hiss of the sleet against the roof. Clara sat by the hearth, and he sat by the wall. They were 2 separate, silent points in the dim glow. She found herself staring at his hands. They were resting on his knees, palms down. They were big, rough hands. The knuckles were scarred, one of them flattened as if it had been broken and healed badly. The fingernails were short, rimmed with dirt and grease. They were not the cold, pale hands of her husband. They were not the cruel, grabbing hands of the townsmen. They were capable hands. Hands that had built this cabin, chopped the wood, cleaned her wounds. Hands that had also, she suspected, known great violence. He did not look at her. He stared into the fire, his profile hard and unmoving. He seemed to be fighting something, holding himself perfectly still, as if any small movement might shatter the fragile, brittle peace that had settled between them. He would not meet her eyes. To look at her felt like a trespass, a violation of the unspoken truce. He would give her his presence, but he would not give her his gaze. And so they sat, 2 broken souls in a snowbound cabin, the storm passing over them, leaving a new, fragile, and terrifying silence in its wake. The morning after the storm, the cabin was changed. The silence was still there, a thick, muffling blanket, but the terror had ebbed. Clara, watching from her corner, realized the howling wind had been a cover for her fear. Now, in the stillness, there was only the sound of Caleb's movements, the crackle of the fire, and her own breathing. Caleb rose, as he always did. In the gray-blue dark, he moved with his usual economy, checking the snow level at the door. It was piled higher than his waist, and then tending the fire. But today, he did something different. After a long moment of staring at the corner where she huddled, he went to a large, battered chest at the foot of his cot. He pulled out a length of thick rope and a heavy, folded canvas, the kind used for mending wagon covers or feed sacks. Clara watched, her body tensing. He said nothing. He looped the rope over one of the low-hanging rafters. Securing it, he unhooked it from the other side, then walked to the wall nearest her. He spent several minutes driving a thick iron piton into the log wall. His hammer blows a jarring, rhythmic intrusion into the silence. He tied the other end of the rope to it, creating a line that sectioned off her part of the cabin. He unfolded the heavy canvas. It was stiff with cold and use, smelling of dust and oil. He began hanging it over the rope, securing it with smaller bits of twine. He was building a wall. Clara's first thought was fear. He was walling her in. He was making her a cage. She pressed her back against the logs, her hands gripping the fur blanket. But the partition he built was not a full wall. It ran 8 feet long and stood 6 feet high, shielding her sleeping area from the main part of the room. It did not close her in. It blocked her from his line of sight. It was a wall of privacy. When he was done, he stepped back, surveyed his work, and gave one sharp nod. He did not look at her. He simply went back to the fire and began to make coffee, the task complete. Clara stared at the rough, stained canvas. He had not done it to pen her. He had done it to give her a space that was hers, a place where she could change her bandages, or sleep, or weep, without his eyes on her. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. It was the first time since her husband's death that anyone had offered her dignity. A small, tight knot of ice inside her chest, a knot she had mistaken for her own heart. Loosened, just a fraction. Life fell into a hard, monotonous rhythm, dictated by the cold and the confinement. The cabin's age and the relentless freeze began to take their toll. The chinking between the logs leaked cold air. The firewood pile dwindled with terrifying speed, forcing Caleb to make daily, difficult trips to the woodpile, sinking to his chest in the drifts. One afternoon, a new sound joined the hiss of the fire, a steady, metallic drip, drip, drip. Caleb froze, listening. The sound was coming from behind the large, cast-iron stove. He grabbed the lantern and moved the stove grate. "Get back," he said. It was not a request. He moved the stove, dragging it, scraping across the floor. Behind it, a small lead pipe, slick with ice, led from a frozen cistern outside to the water barrel. A seam had split. Water, precious and vital, was gushing from the pipe, pooling on the floorboards and turning to a treacherous slick of ice in the frigid air. "Damn it," he muttered. The first curse she had heard from him. This was not an inconvenience. It was a disaster. It was their drinking water. If the cistern emptied, or if the pipe burst completely, they would be reduced to melting snow, a slow, fuel-wasting misery. He ran outside, returning with his toolbox and a bucket of pine pitch. "I need light," he said, his voice sharp. "Here, hold it steady." Clara scrambled from behind her partition, grabbing the lantern. She held it high, the light falling on his back as he knelt in the spreading puddle of ice. "I cannot reach it," he grunted. The pipe was tucked deep in the angle where the floor met the wall. "The rags. Hand me the rags." She grabbed the bundle of clean rags. He tried to wrap them around the pipe, but his large hands and thick shoulders blocked him from getting the right angle. The water sprayed his face, freezing instantly to his beard. "I need your hands in here," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "You have to hold the rags tight. Wrap them, hard as you can. When I say, you pull back." Clara dropped to her knees beside him in the freezing slush. Her knees screamed in pain, but she ignored it. "Like this?" she asked, her voice thin. "Tighter." She pushed her hands into the narrow, dark space, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, cold, and wet. She flinched but held on, wrapping the cloth around the lead pipe, pulling with all her meager strength. "Good," he said. "Hold it." He heated a small iron trowel in the fire, dipped it in the black, smoking pitch, and leaned in beside her. They worked in the cramped space, their bodies pressed close. Her shoulder was jammed against his back. She could smell the cold iron on his skin, the faint, clean scent of the pine pitch. The proximity was suffocating, more intimate than any touch. She focused on the pipe, on the bite of the cold water on her hands, on anything but the man beside her. "I am going to hammer the seam," he said, his voice low, close to her ear. "It will splash. Do not move." He raised a small mallet. Clara braced herself, her hands aching. She was concentrating so hard on holding the rags. She did not notice the ice that had formed on the floor beneath her feet. As she shifted her weight to give him more room, her foot shot out from under her. She cried out, a sharp gasp of fear, falling sideways. Caleb did not think. He dropped the mallet and moved, faster than she could have believed possible. One arm shot out and hooked around her waist, catching her before she hit the floor. He pulled her flush against his chest, his grip like a steel band. Clara was crushed against him. Her face was pressed into the rough wool of his shirt. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. He was impossibly strong, impossibly warm. She froze. All the air left her lungs. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. The moment the debt for her rescue would be called in. She waited for his hand to move, to tighten, to grab. She waited for the grunt, The low voice, the demand. She trembled, a violent, uncontrollable shudder that shook her whole frame. But his hand did not move. He just held her, steadying her, his arm a rigid bar across her waist. He was breathing hard, the sound a ragged counterpoint to the steady drip of the water. He held her for 1, 2, 3 long seconds. He felt the bird-like fragility of her, the way she shook. It was not the trembling of cold, it was terror. Abruptly, as if he had been burned, he released her. He did not push her away, but his arm was gone, leaving her cold and suddenly unsupported. "Watch your feet," he said. His voice was flat, but lower, rougher. Clara scrambled back, her heart hammering. She did not pull away. She had been caught. She had been held, and he had let her go. She watched him turn back to the pipe, his jaw set, a muscle working high in his cheek. They finished the repair in a silence that was deeper and more charged than any that had come before. That night, she did not stay behind her partition. The shared work, the cold, the fall, had broken something in her. She sat on the floor near the hearth, wrapping her raw hands, while he cleaned the pine pitch from his tools. The silence stretched, but this time, Clara filled it. "In 2 forks, she said, her voice so low he barely heard it. Caleb stopped wiping the trowel. He did not look at her. He waited. "My husband was the Reverend," she continued, staring into the flames. "He died from the fever." She paused, as if gathering the strength to lift a great weight. "The women, the other wives, they did not like me living alone." Example, she told him fragments, the sharp, broken pieces of the story. She spoke of the whispers, of Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife. "They said I was a snare. They said I lured their men. I never spoke to their men. I only ever bought nails." Her voice was flat, emotionless. She was reciting a history that had happened to someone else. "They came to the creek while I was washing." She stopped, her breathing hitching. "They said they were cleansing the town of its stain. They tore my dress." Caleb's hands tightened on the oily rag. He could see the map of wounds on her back from that first night, the crisscrossed welts, the angry purple bruises. "They used willow switches," she whispered. Her body began to shake, the memory taking hold. "They held me down, they cut my hair, and they left me in the snow. They told me if I ever came back, they would finish it." Caleb said nothing. He stared at the fire, his entire body rigid. He saw the face of Mrs. Gable, a gaunt, sour woman he bought tools from. He saw the righteous, pinched faces of the other town women. He saw the switches, and then he saw Sarah's face, her eyes wide with terror as the outlaws dragged her away. It was the same thing, the same cruelty, just dressed in different clothes. One was called lawlessness, the other justice. He looked at Clara, truly looked at her. She was not a harlot. She was not a snare. She was a survivor. She was a woman who had been left for dead by good people. His jaw was clenched so hard it ached. He finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "They do not get to take everything from you." The words landed in the small cabin with the force of a gunshot. It was not pity. It was a judgment. It was a promise. Clara looked at him, startled. He was not looking at her with disgust, or even with sorrow. He was looking at the fire with a cold, contained rage that was terrifying and, strangely, comforting. He believed her. The next night, the air between them was different. The confession had settled, and the cabin felt smaller. They ate their meal of beans and salt pork in silence. But it was not an empty silence. It was a silence between them, not just around them. Clara watched him. He ate, his movements economical, his gaze fixed on the table. He was a good man, she realized. Not a kind man, not a soft man, but a good one. He had saved her. He had clothed her wounds. He had given her privacy. He had listened to her. And he had been angry for her. But she was still so cold. The confession had brought the memories back, and now she could not feel anything else. She felt the phantom sting of the switches, the ice on her skin, the cold, wet hands of her husband. She was a ghost. She was a thing that had been acted upon, a thing that had been used and discarded. She looked at her own hands. They did not feel like hers. She needed to feel. She needed to know that her body was still her own, that she was alive. She needed a fire to burn out the ice. After they finished eating, Caleb went to his chair by the fire to whittle. Clara stood up from the table. She did not go to her corner. She walked slowly, deliberately, until she was standing in front of him. He looked up, his hands stilling on the piece of pine. She looked him directly in the eyes. Her own were dark, hollow, but for a tiny, desperate spark. "Please," she said. Her voice was soft, but it did not waver. "Do it quick." Caleb froze. The block of wood and the knife clattered to the floor. He stared at her, his mind blank with shock. Then a slow, cold sickness rose in his gut. He thought he understood. He thought this was a payment, that she was offering herself for the food, for the shelter, that she was so broken. She saw this as the only coin she had left. "Clara," he started, his voice rough. "I need to feel," she said, cutting him off, her voice breaking with a sudden, desperate urgency. "I need to feel like I am still here. I am so numb. Please, I need to feel anything." Oh, he saw it then. It was not desire. It was not a transaction. It was a plea. It was the cry of a person drowning, reaching for a hand, any hand, even if it pushed her under. She wanted to reclaim her body by choosing to have it touched, even in a rough, desperate act. She wanted to use one pain to blot out another. And he understood that impulse. He understood it better than anyone. It was the same impulse that had sent him hunting the Skinner gang, the need to use violence to answer violence. A deep, aching sorrow filled him. He saw her, standing there, offering herself up to be used, just so she could feel alive. Slowly, he got down from his chair. He did not stand. He knelt on the floor in front of her. The gesture of submission, of humility, was so unexpected. It made Clara catch her breath. He did not reach for her waist. He did not touch her body. He placed his large, calloused hands on her shoulders, his grip firm, grounding. He held her at arm's length. He looked her straight in the eyes. His were not empty now. They were full of a deep, ancient pain that matched her own. "Not like this," he said, his voice low and guttural. "Not cold, not numb." He was refusing her, but it was not a rejection. It was a validation. He was telling her she was worth more than a desperate fumbling on a cold floor. He was telling her she deserved to feel, but not like this. The tension broke. The desperate, brittle strength that had held Clara upright dissolved, and she swayed. He held her steady. She looked at him, her eyes wide, and for the first time, she truly saw him. He held her shoulders for a long moment, then released her. He stood up, his face grim. He took his own blanket from his chair and laid it on the floor by the hearth. He lay down on it, his back to her, his back to the room. He left a space beside him. Clara stared at his back. She understood. She took the furs from her corner and lay down on the floor near him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, but not touching. She turned, so her back was to his. They lay there, back to back, inches apart, staring at opposite walls. They said nothing, but in the space between them, there was warmth. Clara closed her eyes, and for the first time since she had fled 2 forks, she slept without nightmares. She woke to the smell of coffee. The light in the cabin was pale gray. She was alone on the floor. She was stiff and cold, but she felt clear. She sat up. Her blankets were where she had left them, but draped over the top was his thick wool blanket. He had covered her in the night. He was not in the cabin. She could hear the rhythmic thud of his axe from outside, biting into the frozen wood. She stood, pulling the wool blanket around her. On the floor where she had been sleeping, next to her furs, sat a small object. It was a hair comb. It was carved from a smooth piece of light pine, the same piece he had been whittling last night. The teeth were a little uneven, the lines simple, but the back was smooth, worn, and carved with a faint, looping pattern, like a wave. She picked it up. The wood was still warm, as if it had just left his hands. She clutched it to her chest, her fingers tracing the simple, carved lines. It was a gift. It was the first thing of beauty, the first thing given freely that she had held in years. The cold settled in. It was no longer a temporary guest, but the owner of the land, a high, thin presence that seeped through the chinking in the logs and pressed against the single pane of glass. The days grew shorter, the light in the cabin turning a permanent, bruised blue, even at noon. The snow, which had been a blanket, was now a tomb, sealing them in. Their world shrank to the four walls, the fire, and the dwindling supplies. The flour sack, once plump, was now a sad, collapsed thing, barely a quarter full. The salt pork was a memory, gone for a week. The bag of dried beans was perilously light. They had coffee, salt, and a little cornmeal. It was the food of scarcity, and it was running out. Caleb grew quieter, if such a thing were possible. The burden of her presence, of another mouth to feed, settled on his shoulders like a physical yoke. He had managed for himself for years, a creature of hard winters, content to live on jerky and beans. But she was different. She was a responsibility he had accidentally chosen. He found himself measuring the scoops of cornmeal, his hand hesitating, calculating. This could not last. The deer were yarded up, miles away in the deeper valleys. He was trapped, and so was she. He looked at her, huddled in her corner, thinner than when she arrived, her eyes too big for her face. She was mending his shirt, her stitches small and neat, a task she had taken up wordlessly. She was trying to earn her keep, but mending did not fill a belly. He made a decision. He pulled his spare rifle from the pegs on the wall. It was a lighter caliber Winchester, a .32 .20, not his heavy buffalo gun. He held it out to her. Clara looked up, her needle stopping mid-stitch. Her eyes went from his face to the rifle, and a flicker of her old fear returned. "You are going to learn," he said. It was not a question. "We need meat. I cannot be the only one to get it." She shrank from the weapon. I do not know how." "I will teach you. Get your coat." The cold outside was a physical blow. It stole the air from her lungs. The snow was packed hard, wind-scoured, the world a blinding, empty white. Caleb pushed a tin can into the top of a snowdrift 30 yards from the cabin. He put the rifle in her hands. It was heavier than she imagined, cold and smelling of oil and steel. "This is not a toy," he said, his voice flat, his words turning to smoke in the air. "It is meat. It is life. You do not point it at anything you do not mean to kill. You understand?" She nodded, her hands covered in his spare gloves, clumsy on the stock. "Stock to your shoulder," he commanded. "Hard. If it is loose, it will kick you. It will break your bone." She pulled it tight, wincing. "Cheek to the stock. Look down the barrel. See the sight? Put it on the can." She squinted. The can seemed impossibly small. Her arms trembled from the weight of the gun. "Breathe out. When your breath is gone, that is when you are steady. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it. Squeeze it, like you are squeezing a hand." Clara took a ragged breath. She tried to steady the shaking barrel. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. It tore the silence of the mountain apart. The rifle slammed into her shoulder, a brutal punch that sent her stumbling back. She cried out, dropping the gun into the snow. The can was untouched. She looked at him, terrified. Caleb's face was stone. He picked up the rifle, checked the action, and handed it back to her. Again. "It hurt," she whispered, her shoulder throbbing. "I told you to hold it tight. You did not hold it tight. Again." There was no sympathy. There was only the task. She set her jaw. She was not a child to be coddled. She was a woman who had been beaten by willow switches. She could take a little pain. She lifted the rifle, jammed the stock hard against the bruise, and sighted down the barrel. The can. The world shrank to the small metal bead and the dark shape. She let out her breath, found the stillness, and squeezed. The crack of the rifle was the same, but the recoil was a hard, solid shove. Not a punch. The can leaped from the drift and disappeared. Clara lowered the rifle, her arms shaking with effort. She looked at the empty space where the can had been. Caleb nodded once. Good. She learned to handle the rifle with a surprising, cold calm. The fear was still there, but she packed it down. The simple, mechanical ritual, loading the chamber, sighting, breathing, squeezing, was a comfort. It was a set of rules. It was cause and effect. In a life that had been nothing but chaos, the rifle was a piece of brutal, simple logic. She was grateful for it. It was something she could finally control. He taught her to set snares, using thin brass wire and a sapling. This she hated. It was a silent, hidden cruelty. But when she checked the line one blue-white morning and found a large snowshoe hare, its neck broken, the sight of the fresh meat overrode her disgust. This was survival. It was not pretty. It was not kind. It was just necessary. They took the rabbit back to the cabin. Caleb handed her his skinning knife. "Now you learn the rest." She had watched him do this before. A grim, efficient process. But doing it was different. She laid the rabbit on the snow-covered stump he used as a block. She made the first cut. The knife was sharp, the skin peeled back. The warmth of the body met the freezing air, and a cloud of steam rose. The smell of the blood, hot and metallic, hit her. She saw the purple-red organs, the small, perfect heart. She was holding a life that she had taken. It was too much. It was the rawness of it all. The blood on her hands, the cold in her lungs, the memory of her own blood on the snow. It all rose up in her, a tide of black, hopeless despair. She was surviving for this? To cut up a small, warm body so she could live another day in this frozen box, with this silent man. Waiting for what? For the snow to melt? For the women to find her? For the world to hurt her again? The knife slipped from her fingers and fell into the snow. She sank to her knees, her shoulders slumping. And she cried. It was not the panicked sobbing of the thunderstorm. It was not the silent, dry grief she had nursed in her corner. This was a complete and total unraveling, a deep, guttural wail of despair that came from the center of her, from the part of her that had held on, the part that had kept fighting. It was the sound of that part finally breaking. "I cannot," she wept, the words torn from her. "I cannot do this. I am so tired." She looked at him, her face a mask of tears and frost. "Why did you not leave me in the snow? I want to disappear. I want to lie down and not wake up. I want it to be over." Caleb stood frozen. He was a man of action. He could fix a pipe. He could set a bone. He could kill a man. He could not fix this. This was a wound he could not see, a brokenness he could not mend. His first instinct was to walk away, to let her have her fit, to go inside where he did not have to hear it. His next instinct was to grab her, to shake her, to tell her to be strong. That weakness was death. He did neither. He remembered her terror. He remembered her request. "Do not leave me alone." He stood there, a silent sentinel in the snow, and he let her cry. He let the wave of grief wash over her, Let it spend its force. He listened to her raw, hopeless confession, and he did not judge, he did not move, he just stayed. Minutes passed. The only sound was her ragged sobbing and the distant sigh of the wind in the pines. Finally, her sobs quieted into shudders. She was empty. He bent down, picked up the knife, and wiped it on his trousers. He looked at the rabbit, then at her. He spoke, his voice low and certain. "You are not broken," he said. She looked up, confused, her eyes red and raw. "You are just buried." He motioned with his chin to the world around them. The snow was 10 feet deep, covering the fences, the trails, the creek. The snow buries everything, the grass, the trail. Even the stream is under there, still running. It is all still there. It ain't broken. It is just waiting. He looked her in the eye. "Spring comes, it always comes. You are just waiting." He offered her his hand. It was not a gesture of tenderness. It was a gesture of fact. "Get up." She stared at his scarred, calloused hand. "You're not broken, just buried." The words were a simple, powerful truth. He was not offering her pity. He was offering her a fact of nature. She was not a shattered thing to be discarded. She was a seed, deep under the ice, waiting. She took his hand. His grip was firm. He hauled her to her feet. "Finish the rabbit," he said. "We need to eat." She nodded. She picked up the knife, and she finished the job. The confession and his response changed them. The last barrier, the one of fear and polite distance, was gone. They were no longer a man and a refugee. They were two people, buried together, waiting for spring. They started to talk, not in long conversations, but in small bursts, filling the long, dark evenings. She asked him about the ranch, and he told her about the cattle he had lost in the big blizzard of '72. "Clean me out," he said, staring at the fire. "Learn then that this mountain does not care about what you want. It only cares about what you are prepared for." He told her about his time in the war, not of the battles, but of the mud in Virginia, the endless soul-killing marches. He even made a joke. She was patching his canvas coat, her work careful, and he was watching her. "You are good at that," he said. "My husband, the Reverend, he demanded perfection." Caleb grunted. "Horses got more sense than most people. Never met a horse that demanded perfection. 'Cept maybe you. You stayed." She looked up, startled, and a small, rusty smile touched her lips. It was the first time. It lit her face, changing her from a ghost to a woman. Caleb saw it and quickly looked away, as if he had seen something too bright, too private. He went back to his carving. The comb had been the first. Now, he carved to keep his hands busy, to keep his mind from the past. He was not good at it, but his carvings had a rough, honest life to them. He carved a small, angular rabbit. When she was asleep, he placed it on the windowsill by her partition. She found it in the morning. She did not say anything, but she put it on the small shelf above her furs, next to the comb. The next night, he carved a bird, its wings half spread. He left it in the same place. They were his words, his way of saying he saw her. One night, the cold snapped with a new, bitter intensity. The wind returned, rattling the door, finding every crack. The fire, no matter how high they built it, seemed to give no warmth. The partition was useless, a thin sheet of canvas against an Arctic chill. They ate their small meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, huddled close to the hearth. After, they did not retreat to their separate spaces. They sat on the bearskin rug, their backs against the warm stones of the chimney, sharing a blanket over their legs. Clara watched him in the firelight. His face was hard, the lines etched deep by grief and solitude, but she no longer saw him as an empty, haunted man. She saw the man who had sat with her in a storm, The man who had given her a wall for privacy. The man who had told her she was not broken. He was as buried as she was, trapped by a past he could not escape. She felt a new, strange emotion. It was not the hollow desperation of her request before. It was not gratitude. It was a deep, aching kinship, a need to reach across the small space and touch the other living, breathing soul in this tomb, to prove that they were both still here, still warm. Slowly, deliberately, she turned. She lifted her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. She laid her palm against his rough, bearded cheek. Caleb froze. His entire body went rigid. He stared at her, his eyes wide in the dim light, 1,000 alarms going off in his head. She leaned in. It was not a desperate lunge. It was a slow, measured, conscious choice. Her lips, chapped and cold, touched his. It was a simple, chaste press of mouths. A question. He pulled back, his face a mask of confusion and warning. "Clara," he breathed. The word a plume of smoke. "I ain't good at soft." It was a warning. It was a confession. He was telling her he was made of sharp edges and old pain. She looked at him, her eyes clear and steady. She saw him, and she was not afraid. "Neither am I," she answered. Her words hung in the air. A final acceptance. She was not a delicate thing to be protected. She was a survivor. She had sharp edges, too. The tension in the air was electric. It was not romance. It was recognition. He looked at her for a long, silent minute. He saw the woman who had learned to shoot, the woman who had broken down and gotten back up, the woman who was now, against all reason, choosing him. He kissed her back. His kiss was not soft. It was hard, almost rough, acclaiming. His beard scraped her skin. His mouth was firm, demanding a response. It was not a kiss of tenderness. It was a kiss of brutal, starving honesty. And she answered it. Not by melting, but by holding her ground, by kissing him back with the same desperate, quiet strength. The blanket fell away. The fire was dying, casting only a low, red glow. The only other light came from the snow-packed window, a pale, ghostly blue light that silvered the room. It was a silent, mutual decision. There were no more words. He put his hands on her waist, and she did not flinch. She put her hands on his shoulders, and she did not tremble. They moved to the bearskin rug, onto the cold cabin floor. It was not tender. It was not passionate. It was raw, and it was necessary. It was as clumsy and real as the rabbit she had skinned. It was the sound of their breathing in the vast silence, the scrape of wool on the floor, the feeling of the cold air on their skin. It was two people, locked in a frozen world, using the only language they had left to prove they were alive. It was not about love. It was about heat. It was about the simple, profound, animal comfort of touch. Afterward, they lay side by side, not touching, staring up at the dark, log ceiling. The cabin was silent, save for the dying hiss of the fire. The cold was already creeping back in. Clara was the first to speak. Her voice was quiet, but it was not the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a woman who had made a choice. "That," she said, her words clear in the stillness, "that was not about desire." She turned her head, looking at his dark profile in the snowlight. "That was about taking something back." Caleb lay still, his arm over his eyes. He heard her. He understood. She had not been taken from. She had not been used. She had not given in. She had used her body as her own, reclaimed it from the memory of her husband's cold piety and the town's violent righteousness. She had taken her own humanity back, on the cold floor, in the dead of winter. He let out a long, slow breath. He turned his head on the fur rug, meeting her gaze in the dim light. "Then," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble, "let's keep taking." The first sign of the thaw was the sound. For months, the world had been silent, muffled by 20 feet of snow. Now, a new sound entered the cabin, the steady, relentless drip. Drip. Drip of water from the eaves. The snow, heavy and sodden, was shrinking from the top of the window, letting in a sliver of bright, true sunlight that cut across the floor. The cabin, which had been a tomb, now felt like a cage, the air thick with the smell of wet wood, old smoke, and two people kept in close quarters for too long. The pressure of the deep winter was lifting, and with it, a new, fragile intimacy grew. Their nights on the cold floor had become a ritual, a silent acknowledgement of their shared survival. It was not a language of passion. It was a language of presence. After that first night, they had moved their bedding, his bearskin and her furs, nearer to the hearth. They slept back to back, a solid line of warmth, a mutual defense against the cold and the nightmares. Their days were spent in quiet labor. Clara had taken over the cooking, stretching their dwindling supplies with a grim creativity. She mended his clothes, her small, neat stitches a quiet marvel. He taught her more. He taught her how to read the clouds, how to tell a good piece of pine from a bad one. He found his old tools and showed her how to use a draw knife, letting her smooth the axe handles he carved. The partition he had built still hung, a useless canvas wall. Neither of them used it. Their privacy was no longer a matter of sight, but of respect. They were two broken, scarred people who had, in the deep cold and silence, begun to move as one. One night, the wind returned, a low, mournful sound that moaned in the chimney. It was a spring wind, a chinook, warm and wet, but it carried the sound of grief. They sat by the fire, the cabin dim, the sound a third presence in the room. Caleb was staring at the flames, his hands idle for once. He had been silent for hours, a deeper, harder silence than usual. Clara watched him, sensing the shift. The wind, or the coming thaw, was digging at something in him. She did not like the wind, he said. His voice was a low rasp, thick with disuse, as if he had torn the words from his own throat. Clara stilled, her hands clasped in her lap. She knew, instinctively, not to speak. She just waited. Her name was Sarah. He said the name as if it were a prayer and a curse, a name he had held under his tongue for a decade. The saying of it seemed to cost him everything. She was coming from Cheyenne, on the stage, to marry me. He picked up a piece of kindling, his thumb rubbing the rough bark. I was not the man I am now. I was full of fire, full of plans. This ranch, it was for her. He stopped. The wind moaned. The stage was late. 2 days. I rode out. I thought it was the snow. But it was the Skinner gang. He spoke the name with a flat, cold hatred. They were animals. They had not just robbed the coach. He looked at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. They had been cruel. They took their time. He was not looking at Clara. He was looking at the memory, burned onto the back of his eyes. They left her for me to find. She was... He choked on the word, a low, guttural sound. He could not describe the ruin they had made of her. He had lived that image every night for 10 years. I found this in the dirt, beside her. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers. He pulled out a small, dull object. It was not on a thong. It was just a thing he carried, a weight. He opened his palm. It was a simple silver ring, blackened with tarnish, bent out of true. It was her mother's, he whispered. I buried her where I found her, and then I went hunting. He told her, his voice flat and dead, about the year he had spent tracking them. The 4 men, the rage that had burned so hot it had turned to ice. He told her how he had brought them back, not for justice, but as a warning. The man he died with her, On that road, he said. He finally looked at Clara, his eyes black holes in the firelight. That is why I am here. That is why folks say I am dangerous. Because I was too late. I could not save her. This was his confession. This was the ghost that haunted the cabin, the shadow she had seen in his eyes from the first day. He was a man defined by a single, catastrophic failure. He was a man who had failed to protect. Clara listened. She did not weep for him. She did not offer him empty words of comfort. She saw his guilt, a mountain heavier than the one they were on. And she understood it. Her guilt over her mother, his over Sarah. They were the same shape. Slowly, she moved from her spot on the floor. She knelt in front of him, so their knees were almost touching. He was breathing hard, as if he had just run a great distance. He would not meet her eyes. She did not touch his face. She did not try to kiss him. She simply lifted her hand and pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the heavy, thudding beat of it, like a trapped bird. "You still carry her," she whispered. It was not an accusation. It was an acceptance. She was not telling him to let Sarah go. She was telling him she saw the burden, and she was not afraid of it. She saw all of him, the grief, the rage, the failure, and she was still there. He looked up, his eyes wide. He had expected pity, or fear. He had not expected this simple, profound understanding. He covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm harder against his chest. He did not speak. He did not need to. They knelt like that for a long time, the fire dying, the wind howling for them both. Their bond, forged in the desperation of survival, was now tempered by this shared truth. The labor of the easing winter became a shared language. They worked together to clear the snow from the lean-to, their shoulders brushing. They spoke of small things, the taste of the coffee, the way the light was changing. He carved her a small, clumsy wolf and left it on her side of the hearth. She mended his gloves, lining them with the fur from the rabbits. They were no longer two people. They were a we. The world returned with a knock. It came in the late afternoon, 2 weeks after his confession, a hard, sharp rapping on the cabin door. They both froze. It was the first human sound from outside in months. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving to the hunting knife on his belt. Clara shrank back, her heart leaping into her throat. "Who is it?" Caleb called, his voice a low growl. "Just Jedediah," a cracked voice answered. "Jedediah Stokes. I got pelts. Caleb. Hoping you ain't dead in here." Caleb relaxed, but only slightly. He unbarred the door. A man stood there, dripping with snowmelt. He was short, wiry, and old, his face a map of wrinkles, his beard stained with tobacco. He was a trapper, one of the few men who knew this mountain. He carried a heavy pack of furs. "By God!" Jedediah breathed, peering into the dim cabin. "You made it. The valley folk said the mountain had swallowed you whole." His eyes found Clara, who was standing half hidden by the chimney. His eyes widened. "And swallowed you with company. I see." "She was caught in the storm," Caleb said, his voice flat, offering no more. "Come in, Jed, get warm." The trapper shed his pack, his sharp, curious eyes darting between Caleb and Clara. He understood the rules of the mountains. You did not ask questions, but news was coin, and he was rich. "The thaw is bad down in Two Forks," he said, accepting a cup of coffee. "Streets are a river of mud. Folks are mean-tempered, stir-crazy." He took a sip, warming his hands. They've been talking a lot, about you, mostly." Caleb just stared at him. "Let them talk." "Aye, but they ain't just talking about you no more." Jedediah glanced at Clara, then looked away, as if embarrassed. "They are talking about the widow, Clara Davies." Clara's blood went cold. She felt the floor tilt. "They are saying," Jedediah cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable. Well, that preacher's wife, Mrs. Davies, has been telling tales, saying the widow was a snare, that she was immoral, that she was lured away by the devil. Caleb's face became stone. And when you did not come down all winter, the trapper continued, his voice low. And she was gone, too. Well, they put 2 and 2 together and got 5. They are calling her a seductress, a witch. They are saying you 2 are holed up here, living in sin. They say she bewitched you. Clara made a small, choked sound. She had thought she was free. She had thought the snow had buried her past, but it had only been waiting, like a seed, ready to sprout new poison. The shame, the terror, the feeling of being hunted, it all came rushing back, suffocating her. She stumbled back and gripped the rough log wall, her knuckles white. She felt sick. Caleb said nothing. His stillness was absolute. It was the stillness of a boulder before an avalanche. The trapper, seeing the look on Caleb's face, drank his coffee in one fast gulp and stood up. Well, I best be moving. Just thought you should know. Folks are riled up. What men? Caleb's voice was soft, deadly. What? What men are talking? Oh, just all of them. Gable, the blacksmith, Hemlock, at the mercantile, the usual. Jedediah grabbed his pack. You take care. Caleb, the spring mud brings out the snakes. He left. Caleb shut the door behind him and barred it. The cabin was silent. Clara was shaking, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. They will come here, she whispered. Caleb, they will come here for me, like before. Caleb did not answer her. He walked to the pegs on the wall and took down his gun belt. He checked the action on his revolver, spinning the cylinder. He took his long hunting knife from its sheath. He walked to the hearth, took the whetstone from the mantel, and sat down. He spat on the stone. Then the sound, shing, shing, shing. The long, slow, rhythmic scrape of steel on stone. It was a patient sound, a methodical sound. It was the sound of death being sharpened. Clara watched him, her terror growing. What are you doing? Shing, shing, shing. Caleb, she pleaded, her voice rising. What are you doing? He tested the blade with his thumb. He went back to the stone. Shing, shing, shing. You are not going, she said. It was a statement of pure, desperate fear. You cannot. It is not your fight. He looked up, his eyes as cold and gray as the whetstone. They do not get to take everything, he said, his voice a low growl. They will kill you, she cried, rushing to him. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. Please, Caleb, do not go. It will not change anything. It will be more blood, more pain. I cannot have your death on my hands, too. He stopped sharpening. He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. His expression was grim, set, a mask of cold resolve. This ain't about them, he said, or you. It is about what is right. He gently, firmly, removed her hand from his arm. They buried me on this mountain once. I will not let them bury you, too. He stood. He began to pack a saddlebag. Jerky, ammunition, a small canteen. Clara begged him. She wept. She stood in front of the door. Please, stay. This is our home. We are safe here. Do not go back there. Do not leave me. He stopped, his hand on the bar of the door. He looked at her, his face softening for just a fraction of a second. He saw her terror, her genuine, selfless fear for him. You were right, he said, his voice rough. I still carry her, but I am not going to carry you too, not like that. He moved her aside, not ungently, unbarred the door. and stepped out into the mud and melting snow. Clara was left alone. The cabin, which had been their sanctuary, was suddenly vast and empty. The only thing left of him was the sharp, metallic scent of the whetstone and the echo of the sharpening steel. He rode for hours, the trail a treacherous river of slush and mud. He did not feel the cold. He did not feel anything but a cold, clean rage. He was not the hollowed-out soldier anymore. He was not the grieving fiancé. He was the man who had been told he ain't good at soft. He was the man who had told her, let's keep taking. And these men, they were trying to steal from him. He reached Two Forks as the sun was setting, painting the muddy street in shades of orange and purple. The town was alive, men coming out of the saloon. He rode his horse straight to the center of the street and stopped. Gable, the blacksmith, a barrel-chested man with a perpetually sour look, was crossing the street. He saw Caleb and stopped. "Well, look who it is, the mountain man. We heard you found yourself a plaything." Caleb swung down from his horse. He walked, his spurs silent in the thick mud, until he was standing in front of Gable. "Her name is Clara Davies," Caleb said, his voice quiet, but it carried in the evening air. Men stopped to watch. "I know her name." Gable sneered. "A witch is what she is. Ought to have been run out proper." "You mean whipped?" Caleb said. Gable's eyes flickered. She got what she deserved. "I am the one who found her," Caleb said, his voice hard. "I am the one who cleaned the wounds your decent women left on her." He did not shout. He spoke as if describing a piece of meat. "I counted the cuts, from her shoulders to her knees. I saw the frostbite on her feet, where they left her in the snow." The street had gone quiet. Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Hemlock, who had been coming out of the mercantile, froze. "You call that justice?" Caleb asked, his gaze sweeping over the watching faces. "You let your women act like a lynch mob, and you call it decent?" "She was a temptation, Mrs. Gable shrieked, her face pinched. She lured my husband." Caleb turned his cold gaze on her. "Your husband is weak, madam. That is not her sin." He turned back to Gable. "You will tell the sheriff. You will tell him what your wife did." Gable laughed. "Or what, mountain man? You will shoot me? The whole town knows you are half mad." "No," Caleb said. "I will not shoot you." He hit Gable. It was not a barroom brawl. It was a single, precise, brutal punch. His fist, hardened by an axe handle, connected with Gable's jaw with a sound like a wet branch snapping. The blacksmith crumpled into the mud, unconscious. Two other men, friends of Gable, started forward. Caleb did not reach for his gun. He met them with a cold, efficient violence he had learned on a dozen battlefields. It was over in a minute. Caleb was breathing hard, but he was the only one standing. The other two were on their knees, spitting blood. Caleb turned and walked to the sheriff's office, leaving the men in the mud. He kicked the door open. Sheriff Brody, a man with a large gut and a tin star that was mostly for show, looked up, his hand on his gun. "I am here to make a statement," Caleb said, his voice a low growl, "about an attack on Clara Davies." "Now, see here, Caleb." "I am the witness," Caleb interrupted, planting his hands on the sheriff's desk, looming over him. "I saw the wounds. I will testify. I will describe, in court, every cut. I will name the women who did it, and I will name the men who let it happen." That is just hearsay." "You think so?" Caleb leaned closer. "Go look at your blacksmith. That is my hearsay. You will press charges against those women, or I will come back. And next time, I will not stop with the blacksmith. I will burn this rotten town to the ground. You have my word." The sheriff looked at the blood on Caleb's knuckles, at the ice in his eyes. He saw the man the legends whispered about. He was not a man to be trifled with. I will look into it," Brody stammered. "You will do more than look," Caleb said. "You will make it right." He turned and walked out. The street was silent. The crowd parted for him. He mounted his horse and rode out of town, not looking back. Public opinion, which had been a solid wall of righteousness, had just seen a man tear it down with his bare hands. The whispers were already changing. Clara did not sleep. She sat in his chair, the empty chair, staring at the door. She held the small, carved wolf in her hand, rubbing her thumb over it until the wood was smooth. Every sound was a gunshot. Every gust of wind was a mob. Just before dawn, the door scraped open. He was there. He was leaning on the doorframe, a dark silhouette against the gray light. He was covered in mud. His lip was split, his left eye swollen shut. His knuckles were raw and bleeding. But he was alive. He was standing. Clara stood up, her legs weak. She looked at him, at the blood, at the exhaustion, the fear she had held in her chest for 24 hours. A cold, hard stone finally broke. She burst into tears. It was not the silent weeping of her past. It was a raw, hiccuping, overwhelming flood. She cried for his pain, for her fear, for the sheer, terrible relief of seeing him alive. She stumbled toward him, her hands outstretched. He pushed off the doorframe and met her in the middle of the room. He pulled her hard against him, his arms locking around her, crushing her to his chest. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in. "You are hurt," she sobbed into his muddy shirt. "It is nothing," he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. He held her, his hand on the back of her head, just letting her cry, feeling the shudders go through her. He held her until the worst of the sobs quieted. Then he pulled back, just enough to look at her. He cupped her tear-streaked face in his one good hand. "You are safe now," he whispered, his thumb wiping a tear from her cheek. He looked into her eyes, his one good eye holding her gaze, willing her to believe him. "You always were." Spring did not arrive gently. It came as a flood, a violent and muddy birth. The world, which had been silent and white, was now loud. The sound of water was everywhere. It dripped from the eaves in a constant, maddening rhythm. It gushed in new, temporary streams down the mountainside, and beneath it all, the deep, thunderous roar of the main creek, now free of its ice, churning with brown, frothy water and the debris of a long winter. The snow did not melt, it collapsed. It sank, revealing the buried world beneath. First came the tops of the fence posts, then the dark, matted grass, brown and pressed flat. The smell of the air changed from cold, sharp ice to the rich, complex scent of damp earth, rotting pine needles, and the promise of new growth. Clara stood at the cabin door, which they now left open for hours at a time. The mud was a sea, thick and grasping, making the world outside almost as impassable as the snow had been, but it was a world of life, not of death. She watched the land she had only known as a white canvas reveal its true self. It was a harsh, rocky, and profoundly beautiful place. Caleb's words from months ago came back to her. "You are just buried." She looked at her hands. The frostbite scars had faded to a pale, shiny pink. Her hair, once hacked short by sheep shears, had grown into a thick, dark shag that curled around her ears. She had gained weight. The hollows in her cheeks were gone. She was no longer the ghost he had pulled from the snow. She was unburied. One morning, while Caleb was checking on the lean-to, which had survived the winter, though just barely, Clara took a walk. Her boots sank into the mud, but she did not care. She walked to the south side of the cabin, where the sun hit first. There, pushing up through the matted brown grass, was a tiny, brilliant speck of purple, a crocus. She knelt in the mud, her fingers tracing the delicate, waxy petals. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was a promise. She spent the afternoon walking the perimeter of the clearing. She was not fleeing. She was exploring, She found small, hardy plants just beginning to uncurl. She dug them up with Caleb's skinning knife, careful to get the roots, cupping the damp earth in her hands. She found columbine, wild geranium, and a small, tough-looking plant with tiny blue flowers she did not know. She brought them back to the cabin. She cleared a patch of ground near the door, a small square of earth that got the morning sun. She loosened the soil with her hands, mixing in ash from the fireplace, and she planted them. Caleb returned, leading his horse, and stopped. He watched her on her knees in the mud, her hands and face streaked with dirt, carefully tamping the soil around a small green shoot. She looked up at him, her expression serious, focused. She was not just passing time. She was making a home. She was claiming the land that had been her prison. He said nothing. He just nodded, a small, almost imper-request approval. This place, which had been his refuge from the world, his place of isolation, was now a home. He was not sure how he felt about that. A week later, the world came to them. Clara heard it first, the jangle of a harness, the suck and pull of wagon wheels in the deep mud of the trail. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the bucket she was scrubbing and ran to the door. Her first instinct, still, was to hide. A wagon was struggling up the last rise, pulled by two exhausted mules. Caleb was already outside, standing near the new woodpile, his axe in his hand. He was not holding it as a tool. He was holding it as a weapon. Clara came to stand just behind him, her hands twisting in her apron. The wagon stopped. It was not Jedediah. It was not a rancher. It was women. At the reins was Mrs. Hemlock from the mercantile, her face grim. Beside her, Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, looking smaller and meaner than Clara remembered. In the back of the wagon, sitting on a crate, was the new preacher's wife, Mrs. Davies, the one who had first pointed the finger. Clara felt the phantom sting of the willow switches on her back. She felt the cold snow, the shame. She took a step back, but her heel hit the cabin's threshold, and she stopped. She would not retreat into the shadows. Not anymore. "What do you want?" Caleb's voice was a low growl. It was the voice he had used in the sheriff's office. "Mrs." Hemlock set the brake and wrapped the reins. She would not meet Caleb's eyes. She looked at Clara, her gaze flickering with a mixture of shame, resentment, and fear. We heard you was alive, Mrs." Hemlock said, her voice tight. "Sheriff Brody, he told us what Mr. Gable said, what you said." "Heard you was hurt bad." "Mrs." Gable chimed in, her voice sharp, trying to hold on to her righteousness. "Heard you was caught in the storm." "I was not caught," Clara said. Her own voice startled her. It was low, and it did not shake. The three women looked at her, surprised. "I was driven," Clara continued, taking a step forward, so she was beside Caleb, not behind him. "By you." Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, stood up in the wagon bed. "The sheriff says, he says we must make amends. He says there will be a fine for what was done." "So you are here for yourselves," Caleb said, his knuckles white on the axe handle. "To beg off the law." "No, Mrs." Hemlock said, too quickly. She climbed down from the wagon, her boots sinking into the mud. It was a hard winter. It makes people think what we did." "You called it justice," Clara said, her voice flat. "You called me a witch. You called it a cleansing." The women flinched to hear their own words, which they had shrieked in a mob, spoken back to them in the cold, clear light of spring. On this silent mountain was a terrible thing. "Mrs." Gable looked at the ground. "Mrs." Davies began to weep, her face crumbling. Mrs. Hemlock, however, held her gaze. It was wrong, she said, biting off the words. The town. It is shamed. My husband, he has not been the same since you— She looked at Caleb. Since you spoke to him. She went to the back of the wagon and pulled out a crate. We brought offerings as a token. She set the crate on a patch of dry ground. Inside were thick, folded wool blankets, jars of strawberry preserves, a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, smoked bacon. It was life. It was warmth. It was everything they had almost died for want of. Clara stared at the crate. This was their penance. This was their apology. A few jars of jam for her back, for her hair, for the terror. A cold, hard knot of rage. Something she had not even known was there, tightened in her chest. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the jars at their heads. She wanted to tell them to take their charity and their shame and get off her mountain. But she looked at Caleb. He was watching her, not the women. He was waiting. This was her decision, not his. Clara walked forward slowly. The women tensed. She stopped in front of the crate. She looked at the red preserves, the clean blankets. She thought of the long winter. She thought of the hunger, the cold. She thought of the blood on the snow. She could not forgive them. Forgiveness was a soft word, a word for preachers and saints. She was neither. Forgiveness meant forgetting, and she would never forget. But acceptance was a different thing. It was a cold, hard, practical thing. It was taking what was offered and moving on. It was a way of closing the door. She reached into the crate. Her hand was steady. She took out a single jar of preserves. She held it, looked at it, and then tucked it under her arm. Then she reached in and took the sack of flour. She did not look at the women. She did not say, "Thank you." She did not say, "I forgive you." She did not say anything. She just took the offerings. She carried them into the cabin. She set the flour on the shelf and the jar on the table. Then she came back out and stood at the door. The women understood. The transaction was over. Mrs. Gable was crying openly now. Mrs. Hemlock's face was pale, but she nodded once, a gesture of sharp, pained respect. They climbed back onto the wagon. We will leave the crate," Mrs. Hemlock said. Clara just watched them. She watched them turn the wagon around, the mules straining, the wheels groaning in the mud. She watched them disappear down the trail. When they were gone, Caleb finally let the axe head rest on the ground. He looked at her. "You did not have to take it." "I know," she said. She was trembling, but her voice was firm. "It was not for them. It was for me." She went inside, and he followed. She sat at the table, her hands flat on the wood. He poured her a cup of water, his large hand brushing hers as he set it down. She looked at him, and he saw a strength in her eyes that he had never seen before. It was not the brittle strength of survival. It was the hard, forged strength of someone who had faced her demons and taken their offerings. The world was open again. A few weeks later, a rider came up the trail. He was not a trapper. He wore a clean shirt and a good hat. He was the foreman for the big cattle company down in the Laramie Basin, a man Caleb had worked for before the war, before Sarah. "Caleb," the man said, dismounting and shaking his hand, though his eyes kept straying to Clara, who was hanging laundry on a line she had strung between two trees. "My God, I heard you was dead. I heard all sorts of things." "I am here," Caleb said, his voice non-committal. "Yes, well, we are putting together a big drive, pushing 2,000 head north to the rail line in Montana. I need a trail boss, a man who knows cattle and is not afraid to use a gun. I thought of you." The foreman named a price. It was a staggering amount of money, enough to buy a real herd, to build a proper house. It is good work, honest work, gets you off this cursed mountain. It was a lifeline. It was a return to the world. It was the life he had once planned. Caleb looked past the foreman, at the cabin, He saw the small, ridiculous patch of purple flowers Clara had planted by the door. He saw the line of laundry, his shirts, flapping in the wind. He looked at Clara. She was watching, pretending not to, her hands still on a wet shirt. He thought of the money. He thought of the noise, the men, the dust, the killing. He thought of the long, cold, silent winter. He turned back to the foreman. "I thank you for the offer, Silas, but I am not for hire." The foreman was stunned. "Caleb, this is a fortune. What in God's name are you doing up here? Just carving wood and trapping rabbits." "I am where I need to be," Caleb said. It was a final answer. Silas, confused and a little angry, mounted his horse. "You are a damn fool. Caleb, this mountain addled your brain." He tipped his hat, a sharp, dismissive gesture. "Ma'am." He rode away. That night, the cabin was warm. The spring air was cool, but the fire in the hearth was low. Just for comfort, they sat at the table, eating a stew made thick with the town's flour and a rabbit he had caught. Clara was quiet. She had heard the offer. She knew what he had refused. "That was a lot of money," she said softly, not looking at him. "Money is just paper." "It was a life," she said, "a life back in the world." He stopped eating. "It was not a life I wanted." She looked at him then, her gaze steady, searching. The cabin was their world, this small, rough room, the mountain, the mud. It had been their sanctuary, but she had to know. Was it his sanctuary or his prison? "Would you ever leave this place?" she asked. If the snows never came again?" Caleb put his spoon down. He looked at his hands, at the scars, at the wood dust ingrained in his skin. He thought of Sarah, of the grave he had dug for her on the open prairie. He had been running to this mountain. Away from that, he had stayed because of her. He looked at Clara. She was not a ghost. She was a woman of flesh and blood, with scars he could see and scars he could feel. He was no longer staying because of the past. He was staying because of her. He met her gaze. "Only if you asked me to." The words settled in the quiet room, as simple and as solid as the log walls. He was not trapped here. He was anchored to her. Clara let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. A slow, warm relief spread through her. That night, they lay beside each other on the furs. The cold was gone. They no longer needed to lie back to back for shared body heat. He lay on his back, and she lay on her side, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand flat on his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. They did not move toward the raw, necessary acts of the winter. They did not have to. This was not about need. It was not about reclaiming. It was about choice. They lay together in the quiet dark, listening to the creek rush by, and they chose to stay. The sun rose soft, a pale gold light that did not have the hard, icy edge of winter. It was a morning that promised warmth. Clara woke first. She lay for a moment, listening to Caleb's deep, even breathing. She slipped from the furs, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She went to the window, which was now clear, open, letting in the smell of pine and damp earth. On the sill sat her small collection of carved figures, the rabbit, the bird, the wolf, and a new one, the one he had finished last night. She picked it up. It was a woman, not a specific woman, not Sarah, not her, just a woman. It was carved from smooth, pale pine. It was not beautiful, not in the way of a store-bought doll. It was rough, the knife marks still visible, but it was not cowering. It was not kneeling. It was standing tall, its face turned toward the sun. Clara closed her hand around it. She felt the smooth wood, the simple, strong lines. The cabin door creaked. Caleb was awake. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his shirt, and ran a hand through his hair. He looked at her by the window, at the light on her face. He did not speak. He just nodded. That small, private gesture that was all of theirs. He picked up his axe from beside the door and stepped outside. The thud of the axe biting into wood began. A steady, rhythmic heartbeat. A sound of work. A sound of life. A sound of a morning just like the one that would come tomorrow. Clara watched him from the window. His broad back, the easy swing of the axe. She held the small wooden figure, and, for the first time, a slow, faint, genuine smile touched her lips. In the quiet of the mountain, with the scars on her back and the grief in his heart, they began again. They were not saviors. They were not just survivors. They were two people, broken and whole, who had, against all odds, finally found someone to stay. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so you can connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.